In October of 1347, a dozen ships drifted into the harbor at Messina, Sicily, and nobody on the docks could figure out why they weren't stopping properly. They were Genoese trading galleys, the kind that usually came in fast and organized, oarsmen shouting, cargo manifests ready. These ships were drifting sideways. Some of the oars weren't moving at all. When the harbor workers finally climbed aboard to see what was wrong, they found most of the crew dead, and the ones still alive wished they weren't. Black, swollen lumps the size of eggs sat in their armpits and groins. Skin had gone the color of a week-old bruise. The survivors could barely speak, and what they did say wasn't reassuring. The city of Messina did the only sensible thing anyone could think of. They ordered the ships back out to sea. It didn't work. It was never going to work. The rats had already disembarked, and so, more importantly, had something you couldn't see at all. Within days, Messina had its own dying. Within a year, most of Europe would. By the time this particular disaster finished working through the continent, something like 60% of Europe's population was dead. Not 60% of a battlefield, 60% of everyone. Bakers, monks, toddlers, kings, the entire apparatus of a civilization, gone in roughly 5 years. To put that in a scale your brain can actually process, imagine losing 3 out of every 5 people you know in the time it takes to finish a university degree. And here's the question nobody really sits with, because it's more comfortable to just say it was a terrible plague and move on. What specifically was happening inside those bodies? Not the metaphor of it, not the symbolism, the memento mori, the skeletons dancing in later paintings, the actual biology. What does a disease have to do to kill 60% of a continent, and why did it take medieval Europe so devastatingly long to even understand what it was fighting? That's what we're going to take apart today. Not just what happened, what it did step by step to the human body, and what it revealed almost accidentally about the invisible systems holding civilization together in the first place. Here's the first strange thing worth noticing. Europe did not invent this disease. Europe was, geographically speaking, one of the last places it reached. The trail runs backward through history like a piece of string, and if you pull on it far enough, you end up in the grasslands of Central Asia, where a bacterium called Yersinia pestis had been quietly living inside wild rodent populations for centuries, causing outbreaks that came and went without ever needing a passport. Marmots, gerbils, ground squirrels, entire ecosystems of small mammals carrying something catastrophic and mostly keeping it to themselves. The problem, as it so often is in history, was trade. By the 14th century, the Mongol Empire had done something almost nobody gives it credit for. It had connected the largest unbroken trade network the world had ever seen, from the Pacific coast of China to the Black Sea. Silk moved west, silver moved east. Ideas, technologies, and diseases moved in whichever direction happened to be convenient. Historians call this general era of connectivity the Mongol Peace, which is a slightly generous name for a period that also happened to be extraordinarily good at moving infected fleas several thousand miles in a matter of weeks. Which brings us to a Genoese trading post called Caffa in the coast of Crimea in 1346, a full year before those ships reached Sicily. Caffa was under siege by Mongol forces under a Khan named Jani Beg, and according to a single surviving account written years later by a notary named Gabriele de Musi, the besieging army began dying of plague themselves, and in a move of extraordinary, almost theatrical spite, catapulted the infected corpses over the walls into the city, apparently hoping the stench and horror alone would finish the job. Now, pause here, because this is exactly the kind of detail documentaries love to repeat without asking the obvious question. Did that actually work as a biological weapon? Fleas, the actual vector of the disease, tend to abandon a host within hours of the body going cold. A catapulted corpse, days into decomposition, is a pretty inefficient delivery system for a flea-borne bacterium. Most modern historians think the siege wasn't really the reason plague reached Caffa's defenders at all. It's far more likely the disease was already moving through the region independently along the same trade routes it had been using for months. And the corpse catapulting, real or not, gets remembered because it's a genuinely unforgettable image, not because it was epidemiologically necessary. This is worth sitting with for a second because it tells you something about how history gets written. The single most viral detail of the Caffa siege might be almost irrelevant to the actual spread of the disease. We remember the catapults, we forget the shipping schedules, and shipping schedules are unglamorously what actually killed Europe. Genoese merchants fled Caffa by ship. Some of those ships stopped at Constantinople, some continued to Messina. And from Messina, it moved along the exact same trade arteries that had made Genoa rich in the first place, because a disease doesn't care whether the ship is carrying silk or salvation. It only cares that the ship is going somewhere with more people in it. So let's actually meet the thing responsible for all of this, because it deserves, if nothing else, a proper introduction. Yersinia pestis is a rod-shaped bacterium, and on its own, sitting in a petri dish, it isn't much of a monster. What makes it catastrophic is its relationship with a flea, usually the species Xenoscilla chiopes, better known as the oriental rat flea, and the flea's relationship to rodents, and the rodents' relationship to the grain stores, granaries, and general clutter of human civilization. Here's the part almost nobody explains properly. The flea doesn't just carry the bacterium like you'd carry a parcel. The bacterium actively sabotages the flea's digestive system. It multiplies inside the flea's gut until it physically blocks the passage where blood is supposed to go down. The flea, now essentially starving despite constantly trying to feed, becomes frantic, biting host after host in a desperate failing attempt to get a meal past the blockage. And every failed bite regurgitates a small dose of bacteria directly into the new bloodstream.
In other words, the disease doesn't just use the flea, it turns the flea's own hunger into a weapon, and it does this by making the flea's situation worse, not better, which is a genuinely upsetting bit of evolutionary engineering when you actually think about it. Once inside a human body, the bacteria travel to the nearest lymph nodes, in the groin, armpit, or neck, depending on where the bite happened, and set up shop. The lymph nodes swell dramatically as the immune system tries, and largely fails, to contain the infection locally. These swellings are the buboes that gave bubonic plague its name, and they could grow to the size of an egg, sometimes an apple, hot to the touch, exquisitely painful, occasionally rupturing on their own. This was, medically speaking, actually the better outcome. Bubonic plague, left completely untreated, killed somewhere around 60 to 80% of the people it infected. Horrific numbers, but not universal death. The other two forms of the disease were considerably less forgiving. If the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, rather than settling first in the lymph nodes, the result was septicemic plague. And this is where a lot of the imagery you associate with the Black Death actually comes from. Blood vessels near the skin would begin to hemorrhage and clot, turning patches of skin black or deep purple, particularly on the fingers, toes, and nose, sometimes leading to tissue death in the extremities. Septicemic plague could kill within a day, sometimes hours, and its mortality rate, without modern treatment, approached 100%. And then there was pneumonic plague, which didn't need a flea at all. Once the bacteria reached the lungs, either from an advanced bubonic infection or through direct exposure, it became airborne, spread through coughing, and transmitted person to person the way a modern respiratory illness does. Pneumonic plague drowned its victims in their own fluid-filled lungs, killed with terrifying speed, often within 24 to 48 hours of symptoms starting, and had a mortality rate close to total. So here's the uncomfortable clarification most documentaries skip entirely. The Black Death wasn't one disease experience. It was three overlapping ones, moving through the same population simultaneously, with wildly different symptoms, wildly different speeds, and wildly different odds of survival, which is part of why medieval physicians, working entirely without germ theory, genuinely struggled to describe what they were even looking at. They weren't stupid, they were looking at what appeared to be 3 separate catastrophes that happened to arrive at the exact same time, because in a sense, they were. Fast fact: modern genetic analysis of dental pulp recovered from mass burial sites. Teeth are remarkably good at preserving ancient pathogen DNA because they're sealed and mineral dense, has confirmed Yersinia pestis as the cause of the medieval pandemic beyond reasonable scientific doubt. This wasn't always settled. As recently as the early 2000s, some researchers seriously argued the Black Death might have been a different disease entirely, possibly a hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola, partly because the recorded spread seemed faster than fleas alone could explain. The dental pulp evidence, published in the 2010s, largely closed that debate, though, as we'll get to, it also opened a different one about exactly how the disease was moving so fast. By the time plague reached Messina in October 1347, it had already devastated trade cities across the Black Sea and eastern Mediterranean. From Sicily, it moved with the terrifying efficiency of medieval commerce, into Genoa, into Venice, into Marseille, into Pisa, because these were, by design, the most connected cities in Europe. The same infrastructure that had made them spectacularly wealthy made them spectacularly vulnerable. A city with no ships had no trade and no plague. A city with 100 ships had extraordinary trade and, within a season, an extraordinary body count. By early 1348, it had reached Paris. By summer, England. By 1349, Scandinavia and the edges of the Holy Roman Empire. By 1351, it had reached Russia, having essentially completed a full loop around the continent from its Central Asian origin point. Which raises an obvious question worth actually asking rather than skating past. How fast is that really? Historians estimate the plague front moved across Europe roughly 1 to 2.5 miles per day on average, which sounds slow until you remember it wasn't walking. It was hitching rides on grain ships, merchant caravans, pilgrimage routes, and army supply lines, occasionally leaping hundreds of miles in a single voyage, and then radiating outward from the new port on foot, cart, and infected flea. Medieval cities were, structurally, almost a laboratory-perfect environment for this kind of catastrophe. And it wasn't because medieval people were dirty in some cartoonish way. It was because of ordinary, sensible urban logistics. Grain had to be stored somewhere. Where grain is stored, rats gather. Where rats gather in dense human housing, fleas eventually find humans a perfectly adequate alternative host once the rat population starts collapsing from the disease itself. Because a dying rat population is, from a hungry flea's perspective, simply an inconvenience to be solved by finding new blood. Which is a genuinely important detail. Plague outbreaks in rat populations often preceded human outbreaks by days or weeks, as the fleas essentially exhausted one host species and moved to the next. Contemporary observers occasionally noticed this. Reports exist of unusual numbers of dead rats appearing in streets shortly before human deaths began climbing. Though without any concept of bacteria or vectors, nobody could translate that observation into meaningful action. Here's where I have to be honest with you about the numbers, because 60% of Europe is one of those statistics that gets repeated constantly and deserves a little scrutiny. The short answer: we don't have a medieval census. Nobody was standing at the gates of 14th century Florence with a clipboard. What we have instead is a patchwork of partial records: manorial rolls tracking tenant deaths, church records of burials, tax records showing collapsed revenue, monastery records documenting how many monks a particular order lost. And historians have spent the better part of a century trying to reconstruct population-level mortality from these fragments.
The most commonly cited modern estimate, drawn from demographic historians including Ole Benedicto, puts European mortality between 1347 and 1351 at somewhere around 50 to 60%, which is actually higher than older estimates from the 20th century that hovered closer to 1/3. That's not because the plague got worse in retrospect. It's because better archaeological and documentary methods kept revealing that earlier historians, if anything, had been underestimating the scale. Some regions had it worse than others, and this matters because 60% as a continental average flattens some genuinely staggering local numbers. Certain Italian and English parish records suggest local mortality rates as high as 70 or even 80% in the hardest-hit communities. Other regions, and we'll come back to this, appear to have escaped almost entirely. So, is 60% known, likely, or still debated? Honestly, somewhere between likely and still debated. The general scale, tens of millions dead across a 5-year window, a genuine demographic catastrophe without precedent in European history, is about as close to settled consensus as medieval historiography gets. The precise percentage, region by region, remains an active area of archaeological and archival research, and probably always will, because you can't interview a 14th century tax collector about his methodology. Question: did rats cause the Black Death? Verdict: partly true, increasingly complicated. Reality: for most of the 20th century, the standard explanation was simple. Black rats carried infected fleas, the fleas jumped to humans, humans died, the end. That explanation isn't wrong exactly, but in the 2010s, a series of researchers, notably a team led by Norwegian scientists modeling the spread rate against historical outbreak data, pointed out something inconvenient. The Black Death appears to have spread across Europe faster than a rat-flea cycle can typically sustain. Rat populations don't move fast, and rat-to-rat plague transmission through fleas, followed by rat-to-human transmission, tends to produce a slower, more localized outbreak pattern than what the historical records actually show. Their alternative hypothesis, still debated rather than settled, is that human ectoparasites, specifically human fleas and body lice, which move directly from person to person without needing a rodent middleman at all, may have played a much larger role than previously assumed, particularly in the plague's fastest-moving phases. Why the myth became popular? Rats make a satisfyingly simple villain. They're visually memorable, they were genuinely present in outbreak-associated cities, and diseased vermin fits neatly into medieval and early modern moralizing about filth and sin, which later historians inherited without much scrutiny. The truth is less cinematic, a disease that was very good at exploiting multiple transmission pathways simultaneously, which made it almost impossible for a 14th century observer to isolate a single cause, because there wasn't one. Evidence: modern epidemiological modeling comparing historical spread rates against simulated rat flea versus human flea/lice transmission scenarios, contemporary accounts noting outbreaks in communities with minimal rat presence, including some monastic and shipboard populations. Question: did doctors wear those iconic beaked masks stuffed with herbs during the Black Death? Verdict: false, at least for this specific pandemic. Reality: that unmistakable image, the long leather beak, the wide-brimmed hat, the glass-eyed mask, is one of the most reused visuals in all of plague iconography, and it's almost always shown alongside footage or art depicting the 14th century. The costume didn't exist yet. It was designed around 1619 by a French physician named Charles Delorme, roughly 270 years after the Black Death, for use during later plague outbreaks in the 16th and 17th centuries. The beak was filled with aromatic herbs and dried flowers, based on the era's dominant medical theory that disease spread through miasma, bad-smelling air itself, rather than any biological agent. Blocking the smell, physicians reasoned, should logically block the disease. It didn't, though. It may have accidentally offered the wearer some minor protection simply by keeping the wearer's own face slightly more physically distant from patients, which is a very roundabout way of accidentally getting something right for entirely the wrong reason. Why the myth became popular? The image is extraordinary. It looks designed for horror films, which means it gets used constantly in any visual content about plague generally, and viewers naturally assume anything that visually striking must be from the main event, the 14th century pandemic, rather than a later outbreak most people have never specifically studied. Here's a question the narrator part of my brain finds genuinely uncomfortable to ask, and yet, did anyone come out of this ahead? The answer, disturbingly, is yes, and understanding who reveals something important about how societies actually reorganize themselves after catastrophe. Peasant laborers, or at least the ones who survived, found themselves in an entirely new economic position almost overnight. With a third to a half of the agricultural workforce dead, the surviving laborers suddenly had leverage that feudal Europe had never really allowed them to have before. Land was abundant, workers were scarce. Basic supply and demand, a concept nobody in 1349 would have phrased that way, but everybody in 1349 was about to experience directly, meant wages for the surviving peasantry began rising, in some regions dramatically, within a handful of years. The English response to this tells you almost everything about how threatened the existing order felt. Parliament passed the Ordinance of Laborers in 1349, followed by the Statute of Laborers in 1351, both of which attempted by law to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and legally compel able-bodied peasants to accept work at those old rates.
It was, functionally, an attempt to legislate the plague's economic consequences out of existence. It did not work particularly well, and the resentment it generated didn't evaporate. Historians widely consider the Statute of Laborers and similar wage suppression efforts elsewhere in Europe to be a significant contributing factor to the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a massive, briefly successful uprising during which rebels marched on London, executed the Archbishop of Canterbury, and forced a 14-year-old King Richard II into direct, humiliating negotiation. The revolt was eventually crushed, but the economic pressure that caused it didn't go away, and over the following century, the rigid feudal labor system that had defined medieval Europe for hundreds of years gradually, unevenly, but unmistakably began to dissolve. Which raises the strange, slightly grim thought worth sitting with. One of the largest steps toward the eventual end of European feudalism was a catastrophe that killed roughly half the continent. Nobody planned that. Nobody wanted that. It happened anyway, because systems under extreme pressure don't usually snap back to their old shape. They reorganize around whatever pressure remains. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, because a population dying at this scale with no functional explanation for why doesn't just sit quietly and wait for modern epidemiology to arrive 4 centuries early. It looks for a cause, and in the absence of an actual correct cause, people tend to find one anyway, which is, unfortunately, one of the most reliable patterns in all of human history. Across large parts of Europe, and especially in the Holy Roman Empire, communities began blaming Jewish populations for the plague, with accusations centering on a genuinely bizarre and thoroughly false theory that Jewish communities were deliberately poisoning wells and water supplies. This wasn't a fringe rumor confined to uneducated corners of society. It led to organized violence, forced confessions extracted under torture, and the destruction of entire Jewish communities, most notoriously in Strasbourg in February 1349, where hundreds of Jewish residents were burned to death in a single coordinated massacre, weeks before plague had even significantly reached the city itself, which tells you something important. The violence wasn't a response to the disease's presence, it was a response to fear of the disease's approach, which is, if anything, an even more damning detail. Pope Clement VI issued papal bulls in 1348 explicitly condemning the violence and pointing out, with what reads today as almost exasperated clarity, that Jewish communities were dying of plague at rates comparable to everyone else, which should have been self-evidently disqualifying as an explanation. It mostly didn't matter. Fear rarely negotiates with logic, particularly when the fear in question is existential and the logic requires patience nobody in a dying town had left to spare. A different, less violent, but still striking response emerged in the form of the flagellant movement, groups, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, who traveled from town to town publicly whipping themselves and each other, sometimes twice daily, as an act of penance intended to appease what they understood as divine punishment. The movement had existed in smaller forms before the plague, but it exploded in scale and intensity during the outbreak years, drawing enormous crowds who watched the processions with a mixture of horror, fascination, and genuine religious hope that this, finally, might be the thing that made it stop. It didn't, obviously. Flagellant processions, if anything, were remarkably effective at spreading disease, given that they involved large traveling crowds gathering in close physical proximity across multiple towns in rapid succession. The movement grew large and organized enough that Pope Clement VI eventually condemned it too, in October 1349, concerned as much by its increasingly anti-clerical undertones. Flagellant leaders had begun claiming a kind of independent spiritual authority that bypassed the institutional church entirely, as by its practical uselessness against the disease itself. Fast fact: the word quarantine comes directly from this period, from the Venetian dialect term 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, the mandatory isolation period the city of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, imposed on arriving ships and travelers starting in 1377, later adopted and extended by Venice itself. Nobody understood bacteria. They understood, empirically, that keeping new arrivals isolated for a set period tended to reveal whether they were carrying something dangerous, and 40 days was chosen partly for practical observational reasons and partly because of the number's existing spiritual significance. Lent, the biblical flood, Christ's fasting in the desert all ran 40 days, and medieval society was extremely comfortable reusing a number that already felt spiritually appropriate. Here's a detail that rarely makes it into Black Death documentaries, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets. Some places genuinely escaped, or came remarkably close, and the reasons why are almost more instructive than the story of the places that didn't. Milan is the standout case. While neighboring Italian cities were losing half their population, Milan's mortality appears to have stayed dramatically lower. Some estimates suggest under 15%, an extraordinary outlier for the region. The likely explanation isn't luck, it's policy. Milanese authorities, under the ruling Visconti family, responded to the first signs of infection with brutal, immediate isolation measures. Houses containing the sick were sealed shut, with the healthy occupants walled in alongside the dying, and movement in and out of affected areas was restricted with a severity most other Italian city-states never attempted. This was, by any modern ethical standard, an appalling policy for the people trapped inside those sealed houses. It was also, epidemiologically, remarkably effective at the city-wide level, because it did, brutally, blindly, without any understanding of germ theory, the one thing that actually interrupts a flea and proximity-driven disease. It stopped movement. Compare this to Poland, which experienced significantly lower mortality than Western Europe generally, likely for a genuinely different set of reasons: lower urban density, fewer major international trade hub cities directly on the primary trade routes plague was following, and, possibly, though this remains debated among historians, decisions by King Casimir the Great to impose stricter border and travel controls in response to early reports from neighboring regions. The lesson sitting underneath both of these examples is one that keeps resurfacing throughout the history of infectious disease, all the way into the 21st century. Understanding why a disease spreads is nice,
but even communities with zero understanding of the actual biological cause manage to meaningfully reduce their own mortality simply by correctly identifying that proximity itself was somehow the mechanism and acting on that observation ruthlessly. You don't need to know what a bacterium is to notice that towns which stopped talking to each other stopped dying together. Let's go back to where we started, because I think this deserves a slower, more deliberate look than most documentaries give it. A person infected with bubonic plague in 14th century Europe would typically begin noticing symptoms within 2 to 7 days of the flea bite: sudden fever, chills, headache, and a spreading, exhausting weakness that made even standing feel like an achievement. Within a day or so, the swelling would begin, usually first noticed as tenderness in the groin, armpit, or neck, rapidly growing into the hard, blackened lumps that gave the disease its most famous name. Contemporary accounts describe the pain of an active bubo as excruciating. Heat radiating from the swelling, the surrounding skin stretched taut and often turning dark from internal bleeding beneath the surface. Some buboes eventually ruptured on their own, draining fluid, which, grimly, occasionally improved a patient's odds slightly since it relieved pressure and reduced the bacterial load somewhat, though 14th century physicians had no reliable way to safely encourage or manage this process and often made things considerably worse attempting to. Beyond the buboes, victims frequently experienced delirium in the final stages, along with intense thirst, vomiting, and in advanced cases, the dark subcutaneous hemorrhaging that produced the blackened patches of skin, fingers, toes, sometimes the nose, that later gave the entire pandemic its enduring name, though it's worth noting that Black Death wasn't actually the term contemporaries used. 14th century writers mostly called it the Great Mortality, or the Pestilence. The phrase Black Death doesn't reliably appear in English until centuries later, likely from Latin phrasing that could be translated either as Black Death or, more accurately according to some scholars, as Terrible Death, Atra Mors, carrying both meanings in Latin, and later translators apparently preferring the more visually striking option. For those experiencing the septicemic form, the progression was faster and, in its own way, crueler in its speed, sometimes killing within a single day of symptom onset, occasionally before the recognizable buboes even had time to fully form, leaving contemporaries baffled as to why some victims seemed to simply collapse and die without the swelling they'd come to associate with the disease. Pneumonic plague victims, meanwhile, experienced a horrifying respiratory collapse, bloody, foamy coughing, difficulty breathing, and often death from respiratory failure or septic shock within 1 to 3 days, a timeline so fast that some communities recorded people appearing outwardly healthy in the morning and dead by evening, a pattern so alarming that it likely fueled some of the era's darkest theories about direct, invisible transmission through breath and air alone. Theories that, as it happens, weren't actually right, they just were centuries away from having a mechanism to explain why they were right. Medieval medicine, working from the inherited framework of the 4 humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and the idea that illness resulted from these falling out of balance, had genuinely no effective response. Bloodletting, one of the era's most common treatments, likely accelerated death in already severely weakened patients rather than helping them. Lancing buboes attempted by some more aggressive physicians, occasionally helped by relieving pressure, but carried enormous infection risk performed with 14th century surgical hygiene, which is to say, essentially none. Herbal remedies, prayer, and isolation, the last of these being unknowingly the only one that actually did anything useful, rounded out the available medical toolkit. Question: did 14th century Europeans genuinely believe the Black Death signaled the apocalypse? Verdict: more complicated than the popular version suggests. Reality: some absolutely did. Apocalyptic religious interpretation was common, particularly among certain preachers and the flagellant movement discussed earlier, but surviving records show something the medieval doom and gloom stereotype tends to flatten out: remarkably practical, bureaucratic responses happening simultaneously with the religious panic. City councils drafted quarantine ordinances. Wills were rewritten with unusual speed and specificity. Guilds adjusted membership and apprenticeship rules to account for sudden labor shortages. Notaries remarkably kept working, which is precisely how historians like Gabriel de Musy left behind the records we still study today. Why the myth became popular? Apocalyptic imagery is vivid, quotable, and fits neatly into a broader modern assumption that pre-modern people were uniformly superstitious and irrational in the face of disaster. The mundane bureaucratic response, city officials calmly adjusting tax codes in the middle of a demographic catastrophe, doesn't make for a dramatic documentary clip, so it gets left out, even though it's arguably more revealing about actual human behavior under extreme stress. Evidence? Surviving English and Italian municipal records from 1348 to 1351 show functioning, if strained, administrative continuity. Wills from the period, held in numerous regional archives, demonstrate detailed, rational estate planning happening in parallel with religious panic, sometimes within the same family in the same month. Here's the detail that tends to genuinely surprise people, because the entire framing of the Black Death implies something that happened, finished, and belongs safely in the past. Yersinia pestis is still here. Plague is not extinct. It's classified today as endemic in several regions of the world, including parts of the western United States, Madagascar, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Peru, among others, with a genuinely regular stream of human cases every single year. The United States alone typically records somewhere between 1 and 17 annual cases, mostly in rural areas of the Southwest, usually linked to contact with infected rodents or their fleas. The difference, obviously, is treatment. Modern antibiotics, streptomycin, doxycycline, and several others, are highly effective against plague if administered promptly, reducing what was once a near-guaranteed death sentence into a serious but generally treatable bacterial infection, provided it's caught early. The disease that reorganized the entire economic and social structure of medieval Europe now mostly makes headlines as an occasional isolated news story about a hiker in Colorado or New Mexico.
That said, and this is worth a moment of genuine caution rather than reassurance, public health researchers do actively monitor antibiotic resistance patterns in Yersinia pestis, because a small number of naturally antibiotic-resistant strains have already been documented, particularly in Madagascar. It remains, as of current research, a manageable concern rather than an active crisis, but it's a reminder that medieval disease is a description of history, not biology. The bacterium didn't get the memo that it's supposed to be over. So here's what I keep coming back to, after spending this much time inside a catastrophe that happened almost 700 years ago. It's tempting, looking back at the Black Death, to see it as something almost alien, a medieval world of superstition and ignorance, stumbling blindly through a disaster that modern science would have handled easily. And in the narrowest technical sense, sure, we would have. We have antibiotics, we have germ theory, we have refrigerated shipping instead of rat-infested grain holds. But look at what people actually did with the information they had. They noticed patterns, dead rats in the streets, sick sailors on incoming ships, even without a framework to fully explain them, and some cities, like Milan, acted decisively on those patterns anyway and saved enormous numbers of lives as a result. They looked for someone to blame and found the wrong answer, viciously and tragically, in the exact same way frightened populations still sometimes do today when the real cause is invisible and the fear is not. They tried to negotiate with an economic system that had suddenly violently changed its own rules, and some of them revolted when the old rules were forced back onto them, in a pattern that has repeated, in various forms, more times in human history than anyone comfortable with the idea of steady progress would probably like to admit. None of that is medieval. All of it is completely, recognizably human. That's really the quiet lesson underneath all of this, I think. History doesn't feel strange because the people living through it were fundamentally different from us, more superstitious, less rational, somehow less real. It feels strange because they were dealing with genuinely impossible information problems using exactly the same brains, the same instincts, the same fears, and the same occasional flashes of remarkable practical genius that we'd bring to the same situation, minus a few centuries of borrowed knowledge we didn't earn ourselves, and mostly just inherited. 60% of a continent gone in 5 years, and civilization didn't end. It reorganized, economically, socially, even architecturally, around the enormous hole that catastrophe left behind, the way it almost always does. The people who lived through it weren't extraordinary. They were ordinary people, doing understandable things inside genuinely extraordinary circumstances, which might be the most unsettling thought to end on, honestly. Not that history is full of strangers, it's that history is full of us. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.